Hello, I'm Andrew Briggs. I am the professor of nanomaterials at the University of Oxford. Nanomaterials just means small stuff. So we do experiments on very small things. For example, we might measure how electricity flows through one molecule at a time. You can't get much smaller than one molecule. I'm also a pilot. So for one of my previous books, The Penultimate Curiosity, after we'd finished the book, my co-author Roger Wagner and I flew around the Mediterranean in a plane with a film crew in the back, visiting places where we'd seen significant developments in curiosity. Today, I want to tell you about my next book, Human Flourishing, which will be published by Oxford University Press in the USA on December 12th this year. And the subtitle is Scientific Insight and Spiritual Wisdom in Uncertain Times. I wrote it with my colleague Michael Rice. And what we want to do in the book is to show how when you bring scientific insight and spiritual wisdom together, they can jointly promote human flourishing in a hugely enriching way. Now, the book's in three parts, plus a final chapter. And the first part is about what is human flourishing. We identify three dimensions of human flourishing. One of them is the material dimension, because it's hard to flourish if you haven't got adequate food or housing or access to essential healthcare. And the material dimension of human flourishing has been improving over time. And there are parts of the world where, in this case, projected by 2030, poverty will almost have been eliminated, but not everywhere. And so the material dimension of human flourishing matters, and it still needs attention paying to it in parts of the world, especially if you include not only the obvious material things, but other things that you could think of under this category, like freedom from conflict. But even when you have material well-being, that's not enough. So the next dimension, I could just say a little bit more about that material well-being by itself, while it's a sort of necessary condition for human flourishing, is not sufficient. So if you look at this chart here, if people have too little wealth, then it's very hard for them to feel that they're flourishing. So the left axis is dissatisfaction. But there are some people who have rather little wealth who nevertheless have a low level of dissatisfaction. And there are others who have actually quite a lot of wealth, but still are higher up on the dissatisfaction scale. So this material dimension is important. One of the things that matters is comparative wealth, actually. So if you look, next slide, at the income inequality. This looks as if it's designed for management because the axes don't have any units on them. But in fact, the research from which this is taken do give proper units to the axes, and they explain how they're measured and calculated. But you find that if you take the index of health and freedom from social problems, if you've got high income inequality, then that makes things worse, even when you have income that by absolute terms is not too bad. And I'm sorry, but you can see that the USA comes worst off in this chart. And countries like Japan, you see, come off extremely well. But even when you address these issues and you have a good score on the material dimension to human flourishing, there's the relational dimension. It's not good for the man to be alone, as the story in Genesis chapter 2 says. And we need people. We're designed to be social. The way that other people value us is important to our own human flourishing. Solitary confinement is a terrible punishment to have, and for good reason. It's banned for more than 2 weeks, though, alas, in parts of the world that is violated. And so here's some simple data. Of course, there are people who've never married. For some of them, it might be a choice for reasons they've made, who flourish and are very happy. But if you take the thing on average for large numbers of people, and you ask them about their self-report of whether they feel very happy in their lives, there does seem to be a positive correlation between marriage and feeling very happy. And you can see that the trend is very slightly upwards, but by and large, significantly more people who are married also say that they're very happy. Of course, the causation could work either way. Even when you've got those two dimensions of flourishing, there seems to be more to it than that. And the third dimension of flourishing, we've called the Transcendent Dimension. And this can be something that's particularly important to people of religious commitment. And there are, measures of when people participate in religious services and religious worship, how that correlates with greater health and happiness. But it doesn't have to be that. This is something that I think everyone can recognize. Everybody who looks at a sunset and appreciates it, or enjoys poetry or music or any of the other creative arts, dance. Wordsworth, talked about, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns. And when you hear people talking like that, you can sort of resonate with what they're saying. Yes, it does seem that even when we have the material and the relational dimensions of human flourishing, yes, there does seem to be something beyond that, something which, if you like, we can call the Transcendent Dimension. Now, these three dimensions of flourishing are not suspended in midair with no visible means of support. And so in part 2 of the book, we identify 3 pillars of human flourishing. One of them is the pillar of truth, because we don't believe that it's possible to flourish without some recognition of the truth and some sense in which flourishing corresponds to what is true. I like this chart very much. This is a measure from a poll a little while ago of which professions are considered trustworthy and which are untrustworthy. And because I'm a scientist, I like this result very much indeed. I don't know what you think of politicians coming at the bottom of the trustworthiness scale, and whether you think that might fluctuate according to who you ask and which politicians are in power. But there we are. I love that graph. So there's this truth element, and then another element, the element of purpose. Because even when we've recognized what's true, we seem to need a direction of our lives. We seem to need things that we're aiming to achieve, if you like, things that we're aiming to contribute, things that will help to make the world a better place. And so in my own case, my part of my purpose is doing science and helping to understand the world better and helping others to understand the world better. And then there's a third pillar that we've identified of meaning. Some people sort of incorporate purpose in meaning, and I understand why that is. But there's a further sense of meaning because people want to live a meaningful life. They don't want to live a meaningless life. And one of the things that we found for all these three pillars is that they all involve measures of human choice. You might be surprised to think that, to find that I say that truth involves human choice, because you might say, well, you know, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. And yet somehow truth does involve choices, because it depends where we choose to look for truth. And it depends on the tools that we choose to use to try to find truth. So science, my own profession, provides a marvelous toolbox for finding truth about certain aspects of the world. But it would be an impoverished concept of truth that could only be discovered through the methods of science. And purpose, you know, people talk about finding a purpose for their lives, and I understand why they mean what they mean by that. They even talk sometimes about looking for a purpose in the universe. And again, I understand what they mean by that. But there's also a sense in which we have to choose a purpose, or perhaps even create a purpose for our lives. And meaning involves huge amounts of choice too, because it depends on the interaction. You know, meaning is in the context of communication and engaging with what the other person's saying. This is a painting by Roger Wagner, who I mentioned earlier on, the artist. I think it's a fabulous painting. He kindly let us use a detail from this painting for the cover of another book called It Keeps Me Seeking. But if you say, what does the painting mean? There's a sense in which Roger could say some things about what it means, but there's also a sense in which its meaning depends on the way that the viewer engages with the painting. And if that's true of paintings and music and dance and other creative works in life, it seems to me that it's also true of ultimate reality too, that if we're trying to find meaning in our lives, it will depend on the choices that we make to engage with the reality that's out there. So these are the three pillars of human flourishing. And then in part 3 of the book, we move on to try to apply these concepts, the 3 dimensions of human flourishing and the 3 pillars that we identify that human flourishing rests on, with the changing contexts in which we find ourselves. This part of the book, I suppose, is the bit that will date most quickly because the contexts are changing. But we felt that it was useful to give sort of case studies of how to apply the principles to things that are changing rapidly in the world now that we identify, because case studies like that help to show how you might apply the principles to other contexts as they come along. And the first context that we think of is the limits to predictability. And I think that one of the things that's happened during the pandemic over the last year or so is that we've either failed or succeeded in getting better at living with uncertainty. Here at the University of Oxford, where I'm speaking from today, where I'm a professor, we sometimes feel that we've got a generation of students. We've never known a generation of students that seems to have been so stressed. And we think that that manifests itself in mental health. At its worst, it manifests itself in suicides. But even for people for whom it's not as extreme as that, there seems to be a very high level of stress. And one of the reasons, maybe because of a culture that has unrealistic expectations of the extent to which you can be in control of your destiny. So we love equipping people to contribute to the world, equipping them academically, We love it when people are very determined and have a vision, and in the best sense of the word, are very ambitious. But if that fails to take account of the uncertainties in life and the things that happen that we have no control over, then it can lead to undue stress. One of the things that's changing, we think, in the world of economics and business is the old model of what's sometimes called Homo economicus, economic man, who can be characterized as being rational, greedy, selfish, and lazy. And that in the world of economics is being changed because it's recognized that there are plenty of other things that can motivate people. And one of them is identity. Who do you identify with? Shows how in times past, when cigarette manufacturers were trying to boost their cigarette sales, they they were creating this sort of identity of the successful woman who will smoke their cigarettes. I hope that's changed since then, but there can be other things that motivate humans. Identity can be a good one, because you can want the well-being of the people you identify with. And there are other kinds of motivation, like motivations for cooperation and so on, which are being increasingly recognized. So that's one context that human flourishing is changing. The second one that we looked at is changing patterns of religious commitment. Patterns of religious commitment are changing around the world. Some secular people talk about a post-Christian Europe, and I'm not sure that's true, but even if it is, you may start to think of a post-European Christianity. So according to one set of figures, the continent with the largest number of Christians in it now is Africa. And for sure, I think patterns of religious commitment will be influenced by patterns of changing patterns of population. The evidence in China is necessarily anecdotal, but people talk about enormous growth in the number of Christians in China. I myself am involved in a project of bringing science to the Anglican Communion worldwide, and this illustrates the Anglican Communion total membership. And last summer, I had the privilege of interviewing Anglican leaders around the world, particularly in the global south. And it's just amazing the level of commitment they have and the desire that they have to engage with science. And this question of the contribution of science to human flourishing in the context of religious commitment is illustrated by data from the Wellcome Trust survey. And on the left, you see a graph of the percentage of this was done by the Wellcome Trust. They interviewed something like 140,000 people for this survey, and in 140 countries around the world. This is the percentage of the whole population who say that science disagrees with their religion. And it's a bit embarrassing to see which of the countries have the darkest coloring on that map. And then on the right, and you'll see the distribution is slightly different, is the percentage of the whole population who say that they would choose their religion over science in cases where they perceive them to be in conflict. And, it seems incumbent on scientists like me to help to correct that, because the two shouldn't be in conflict. In my view, they're not in conflict. And the religious dimension has got a terrific contribution to make to human flourishing. This picture from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Africa illustrates just one, because any electrical engineer knows that in network theory, and indeed in computing, you have to have a process of fault-tolerant error correction, because errors will occur and you have to have a way of coping with them and correcting them. And in fact, in my own field of quantum computing, it was an absolute breakthrough contributed to by one of my co-authors in It Keeps Me Seeking. People thought that fault-tolerant error correction would be impossible in quantum computing. And when Andrew Steele and others showed that it could be done, that revolutionized the vision for how quantum computers could be made to work. And if that's true in quantum computers and in network theory, it's also true in human relationships. We're human, we're error-prone, mistakes occur, some of them willful, some of them accidental, and we have to have a way of coping with that. And the way of coping with that that is offered by the Christian faith is forgiveness. And forgiveness can be exercised by people, whatever their religious commitment, whatever their faith commitment. But of course, the Christian faith gives additional theological insight into why forgiveness is so costly and how it can contribute to the transcendent dimension of human flourishing. And the third example that we give is human flourishing in an age of technology. So I'm a sort of nerd. So this is the sort of chip that we use in my laboratory. We use this for machine learning because in the lab, the machine learning, the artificial intelligence actually decides what the next experiment will be in real time, and it executes it in real time. And we have a server of 16 of these chips, and the current generation of these chips that we use each have almost 60 billion transistors on each chip. That's nearly 7.5 for each member of the human race. And depending on how you think about these things, it's almost as many neurons as you've got in your head, or if you like, if you're a cosmologist, it's almost as many stars as there are in our galaxy, or almost as many galaxies as there are in the visible universe. And so this kind of technology is making a huge difference. The importance of technology for human flourishing has been brought to everybody's attention by the pandemic. And you may be amused of this, which is from it's just over 100 years ago when what was called the Spanish flu came along. And these were the instructions that people were given in 1918 to avoid the passing on of the Spanish flu. Of course, it's quite funny to see that sometimes, well, we're very proud in Oxford of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which really does make a difference. Sometimes placebos make a difference. I quite enjoyed this picture of the man in the pharmacy trying to decide whether to get placebos or extra strength placebos. So we talk about technology as the third one, and then we try to bring all this together in the final conclusion. And we call the conclusion actionable love. And we've sort of waited until the end of the book to talk about love. And you may think, well, why wait till the end? You know, if you're talking about human flourishing, how can you talk about human flourishing without talking about love? And we sort of feel that there are two reasons for that. One is because we wanted to save the best until last. And the other one is because the trouble with a word that means too much is it can end up conveying rather little. And love is such a big concept. It's so all-embracing that we sort of felt people needed everything we'd written in the book up till then in order to understand what we meant by love. And this is some rather, to me, terrifying data of where people are looking for human flourishing. This is data from US college students, and it shows the change that's taken place in about 50 years, half a century, a decline in people thinking that what they really want is to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, an increase which is almost flattened off to something approaching about 80% who feel that what's very important to them is being very well off financially. And if you followed what I've been saying so far, you'll see there's a mismatch between the data on that graph and what will actually promote human flourishing. And what will actually promote human flourishing, we think, are those three pillars of truth and purpose and meaning, in each of which there's a choice to be made. And when people make wise choices about those, then it will promote flourishing, not just for themselves, but for others too, and for the communities that they live in. And that change will be driven by love.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'd love to invite Ben Sanders into the conversation as well. And we can just discuss, just some of the topics that you shared. Ben, what are maybe some thoughts or questions that you have to get us started here?
Well, it's as an American who is also a campus pastor, it was somewhat troubling, more than somewhat troubling, to see some of the graphs about how we as a nation stack up, and also as a profession. I think we were at about 20% in terms of trustworthiness, pastors and clergy, slightly over politicians. So that
and above bankers, Ben, above bankers.
So clearly we have some work to do and some repentance. And scientists, of course, proved very well. So that was a score for you and your colleagues. So that was, and then of course, seeing how the US stacks up with other, in terms of other nations, developed nations, and how economic inequality has such an impact. That was sobering as well as an American. And we know that we've got a lot of work to do. But I very much appreciate how you end, and to be quite honest, to go through all the statistics, to go through all the, sort of the rational analysis, to end with actionable love, that was surprising to me. But I completely agree. And I appreciate the fact that you talk about actionable love, because love without action really is not love. So perhaps you've given us some marching orders. That's the way I take this, is that there is some serious work that needs to be done in our own country in terms of, frankly, some sobering statistics. But you end with exactly, I think, the solution, and that is, how is love acted out? And I've been encouraged, by the way, with some pastors who are doing remarkable things in our own nation to demonstrate actionable love to our communities. I'll give a special shout out to Eric Swanson, who is a wonderful sort of chronicler of all the, and awareness of all of these sorts of activities that are going on throughout our own nation and beyond. And I'm happy to say that there are pastors who do care about these things and in trustworthy ways are leading out to help bring about flourishing in communities in the US and beyond. So I'll simply say, all is not bleak, but we have a lot of work to do.
I think that Ben, one of the things that's been enriching for me is with this new Science Commission project that I'm developing with the Anglican Communion worldwide, has been talking with some absolutely wonderful church leaders around the world, and particularly in the global south, where we're going to have quite a focus for this Science Commission. And they are just wonderful people. The Archbishop of Canterbury said he sometimes thinks of the average Anglican as a woman in her 30s in sub-Saharan Africa living on $4 a day and with a 50% probability that she's in a conflict zone. And that helps to bring into sharp focus a sort of wider picture of what's going on in the world and what it means for humans to flourish in those kinds of contexts. And so we talked about a lot of things. Time and again, we talk to people who are doing just amazing work, absolutely amazing work. For example, the Archbishop of Alexandria, the first half of his career was as a medic, as quite a senior medic, actually. He ran a major hospital. He was the director of a major hospital in Egypt. And here he is in a predominantly Muslim country, just doing wonderful things and giving wonderful leadership, and in his case with responsibility also for areas like Sudan and so on. And you can see what's happening in the Yemen and things like that. And then there was another thing that we've learned from that, which is specifically the contribution of science, which is a personal interest of mine. And the issues to address are just so different from what you might find students talking about if you had a quote science faith dialogue in in ASU or something. You can imagine the sort of questions that might come up there. In the global south, they're so much more practical. It's so much more to do with water security and land security. Or in the Polynesian islands, for them, global climate repair doesn't just mean switching from a gasoline-powered car to an electric-powered car, which is what it might mean in Arizona. It means, will my island be underwater if the sea level rises too much? Will my whole island disappear underwater? The issues there are so practical and so urgent, and they are so hungry for the best of science and technology as a resource for their practical work, as well as being a resource for the sort of transcendent dimension and worshipping the creator. There was a in the sort of metaphysical poets in the UK, with the rise of science and the weaponization of science. The poets talked about unweaving the rainbow. They said, well, if you just analyze the rainbow in terms of the science of it, doesn't that spoil it for you and take away all the romanticism? Well, I have to say, when I look at the sky and I think, why is the sky blue? And I look at a sunset and I say, why do I get those fabulous, rich red colors in a sunset? As through science, one begins to understand them, that it's the fourth power of the wavelength that's causing this coloring effect. I can only talk personally, for me, that enriches it. I think, wow, this is fantastic. So I find my appreciation greatly enhanced by that, not diminished by it.
So you can combine both scientific understanding and a creative and even poetic vision.
I've been doing that all my life, and I find it hugely enriching. In fact, sometimes I have to work hard to get my head around why some people find it difficult, actually. I think I do understand why they find it difficult, but that doesn't come very naturally to me.
Well, Andrew, you're an amazing bridge builder. I think that's how I see you, because you are operating in a variety of realms. I really appreciate your project in terms of engaging the global south. I think you're right that's so often when we are inward focused, we find, that's where we struggle. That's where we have problems. But when we turn our focus outward and not just within our own communities, but in the world, I think that can be truly a source of flourishing and happiness and joy. And you clearly have taken that on in a major project. Would you like to share any more about that specific project? Because I think it's showing an important way forward.
Oh, with pleasure. Yes, Ben. So when I started this, I've been working on it for a little over 2 years with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the president of effectively the Anglican Communion worldwide. So we wanted to reach 80 million people with science in 165 countries. And you're only going to be able to do that if there's a network that's in existence. And the Anglican Communion is that. And it's taken a little over 200 years, depending on when you start counting, to build up. And it started off by wanting to promote science as a God-given resource for the life of faith and for the work of the church. And as I've been interviewing people around the world, you know, we've discovered just what a big need that can meet and what an appetite there is for it. So that's very exciting. But I've learned quite a lot more too. So one of the things that I've learned is that this is very much a two-way process. So I've been thinking on the one hand, how science is a God-given resource for, as I say, the life of faith and the work of the church. But what I've also come to appreciate much more is the extent to which the church has so much to offer, because in terms of courageous and confident leadership, because there's so many issues coming up with science and the technologies that arise from it that require an ethical input. And you know, time and again, the ethical input that's needed is to do with, well, certainly technical issues. So if you're talking about the use of machine learning by the big data companies and the targeted influence that there is, where the stories are absolutely terrifying. Do you know that you can go to companies in Eastern Europe with a lie that you want promulgated, and you can tell them who you want them to target with this lie, and they will tell you how much it will cost, and you pay them the money and they do the job for you. You know, it's like engaging your attorney to draw up a contract for your house, or an advertising agency to advertise your product, except in this case, it's to send out lies. And it started in Russia in about 2007, and it's quite well documented this. There's now quite a center of them in China. But the geographical center of these industries that you can just pay to do it seems to be in Eastern Europe, as far as we can make out. And again, it's very well documented that the Oxford Internet Institute has a large team that's been gathering the facts on this. So that needs an ethical voice. But it's not only that, you see. You can think of other issues like gene synthesis. Happens I'm on the board of a company that is developing a way of doing gene synthesis. So in that case, gene editing, I don't know if any of you at ASU heard the lecture by Jennifer Doudna a couple of years ago, which Paul Davis hosted. And she gave a fabulous lecture. And then, of course, she was later awarded with an honorary degree by the University of Oxford. And then finally, the Nobel Committee caught up with it and awarded her a Nobel Prize. Rightly so. It's a fantastic piece of science. And it has, you know, the potential for rather, well, it's already being used to correct single gene defects like Huntington's disease and so on. But that's more like someone hands you a document they've written and you switch on track changes and edit it, you see. The gene synthesis is more like starting with a blank document and deciding what you're going to write. Now, it's a long way down the road. It's science fiction at the moment. But supposing the day one comes when we can genetically enhance humans. And if you've read Kazuo Ishiguro's latest book, which is called Clara and the Sun, they talk about people being lifted. And that's the word in that novel, for people being genetically enhanced to improve their probability of getting into an elite university. So that's novel, that's fiction, okay. But you can imagine, supposing it came one day and you could, as a parent, decide what attributes of your offspring you wanted to enhance. All right. How would you exercise responsibility for that? And although the details are completely different, the deeper you go in these, the more it gets down to, well, what do you think promotes human flourishing? And the church has been thinking about that for 2,000 years or more, building on what came before, and ought to have something to contribute. And in order to contribute, you need to get your head around the science, or at least to be very well briefed about the science. And so we're now seeing this as a two-way process. You see that science is going to contribute to the life of faith, but those of faith have something to contribute to science and its deployment and the technologies that arise from it. And then there's another thing that we're finding to be two-way, and to simplify it, you can think of that as a sort of north-south two-way process. So it may be that, there's a little bit of what we've been thinking about how science contributes to faith, that we can contribute to these other people around the world. But my goodness me, they've got a lot to contribute to us. And I hope this will happen at a practical level. And I also hope it will happen at the level of scholarship, because a lot of the scholarship in this area has been sort of dominated by Western industrialized thinking and considerations and so on. And I think that as the project goes forward, we'll find ourselves greatly enriched by the insights that we shall get from leaders and others in different parts of the world to which we've been hitherto less exposed. And I'm really looking forward to that.
And I'm in agreement that I think it's a very exciting project. My wife is Anglican, and I think, and is part of a congregation that's very involved and connected into Rwanda. And I agree that the opportunities to build relationships is so crucial, that are going both ways. I'm delighted by the African students that are at our university, because they are almost all in science and engineering coursework, but they're also very, very committed in their faith. And it's been delightful to learn from them and to see their example. And I think that they give great hope. I have hope from the young people, the students that we know. Working with students in a university always keeps you younger, and gives hope, because the next generation I'm always amazed by and blessed by.
Mm. I'm sure that's right. And I should say that this is Anglican, not for the sake of being denominational, but just because that's how it will work. That's the network that we're going to work through, and we hope it'll contribute to that. And if others look at that and say, hey, this works rather well, we'd like to do it too, we shall be absolutely delighted.
Well, we have the Society of Catholic Scientists, who are part of our conference. We have American Scientific Affiliation and Christians in Science, Science for the Church. We have some wonderful groups that are working on very similar kinds of projects and work. And I think one of our desires is to think about how we can all work together as the body of Christ, because certainly the problems that we're confronted by in our times are daunting. And it's only by, I think, really the whole body of Christ working together, being fitly joined together, to be built up in love. Again, going back to this idea, what should be distinctive about Christians is that we love God, but we love people. And I think that's such a crucial aspect of human flourishing.
Absolutely. Ben, what a lovely note to end on. Shall we draw it to a close there? Because I think you've said it so beautifully.
Thank you, Andrew.